The American continent. A landmass so big it could be divided into 2 or 3 others. The Americas are also known as the New World, a land most contradictory, being both new and old, modern and traditional, poor and rich, and all other possible oxymorons. Still, nonetheless, people from outside of it know little about its depth. But just how deep does the Americas Iceberg really goes? Discovery. The discovery of the Americas is one of the most important events in history. In the official, most popular story, in 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean under the Spanish crown, permanently linking the Old World and America. When he first arrived, he had no clue that he had just stumbled onto a hemisphere that already had over 50 million people. The Americas weren't empty land. They had cities, trade routes, agricultural systems, and thousands of distinct cultures that the Europeans would later encounter. So the word discovery is really just the first contact. There are, however, other theories and stories about the discovery of the Americas. Natives. Which brings us to the people who are already here. Indigenous people of the Americas are incredibly diverse. We're talking about thousands of distinct ethnic groups, speaking hundreds of languages, living in ecosystems ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests, from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the Northeast, whose democratic structures may have influenced the US Constitution, to the Maya in Mesoamerica, to the Mapuche in South Chile. These weren't primitive hunter-gatherers frozen in time. They were sophisticated civilizations with complex politics, art, science, and spirituality. We'll go much deeper into specific cultures as we descend the iceberg. Wars. As is the case with every other instance of human existence, the Americas have a great list of wars. Native on native war, European on native war, native on European war, European on European war, you name it. But when you think of the American continent, you probably first remember the many wars of independence that happened, most notably the US War of Independence and the Haitian Revolution. Colonies. America was split between most major European powers ever since its discovery. The Spanish, Portuguese, British, French, Dutch, you name it, created the colonial foundations of almost every American country today, both the bad and good foundations. Natural beauty. When it comes to natural beauty, every continent can be the top contender to the most gorgeous one, depending on what you find beautiful. But if we consider the Americas as a whole, then it would surely be the most fit contender for the most beautiful continent. It is home to tundras, rainforests, deserts, mountain ranges, canyons, tropical islands, and much, much more. We're talking about the Grand Canyon, Guazú Falls, Patagonia, the Caribbean islands, the Rockies, the Andes. The Americas contain some of the most spectacular landscape on Earth. Cities and empires. The American continent has been called home by many empires and interesting cities. At its peak, Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, built on an island in the middle of a lake, had a population of around 200,000 to 300,000 people. That fact made it one of the largest cities on Earth at the time. Bigger than London, bigger than Rome had been for centuries. The Inca Empire, stretching over 4,000 kilometers along the Andes, was the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas and one of the largest in the world. It had no writing system as we understand it, and yet it ruled over millions of people, moved armies across mountain ranges, and built roads that still exist today. Humans do human stuff everywhere. So the way the native people of America created their societies was very similar to any other culture. The Amazon. The Amazon rainforest covers about 4.5 million square kilometers. It produces roughly 20% of the world's oxygen. It contains somewhere between 10 and 15% of all species on Earth. It is, by almost any measure, the most biodiverse place on the planet. We now have strong evidence that the Amazon was far more heavily inhabited and actively managed than anyone realized. LiDAR surveys have revealed the outlines of roads, earthworks, and settlements hidden under centuries of regrowth. Some researchers estimate that millions of people may have lived in the Amazon basin before European contact, and that the forest itself was shaped by human hands. We'll revisit this when we get much deeper into the iceberg. The Mayan calendar. This topic is only this high because in 2012, the entire internet was briefly convinced that the Maya had predicted the end of the world would happen that year. But then, 2012 passed on without incident and everyone moved on. The Maya never predicted the apocalypse. What the year 2012 marked was the end of a major cycle in the Mayan long count calendar, a period of about 5,125 years, called a Baktun. For the Maya, this wasn't an ending. The Mayan calendar system itself is genuinely extraordinary. The Maya used multiple interlocking calendar systems simultaneously. The 365-day solar calendar, the 260-day ritual calendar, and the long count for tracking longer historical periods. Their astronomical observations were remarkably precise. They could predict solar eclipses and track the movement of Venus with great accuracy, considering they lacked telescopes. Monuments. The Americas are full of structures that raise far more questions than they answer. Machu Picchu sits atop of the Peruvian Andes. It was built by the Inca in the 15th century, using stones fitted together so precisely that you cannot slide a piece of paper between them, and all of this without iron tools, without the wheel. How the Inca quarried, transported, and placed stones weighing several tons on steep mountain terrain remains an active topic of research. The Nazca lines in southern Peru are massive geoglyphs, drawings etched into the desert floor, depicting animals, plants, and geometric shapes, some stretching hundreds of meters across. They were made by the Nazca culture roughly 2,000 years ago, and they can only be fully appreciated from the air. What were they for? Ritual purposes, astronomical alignments, offering to gods, or something else entirely? We'll probably never have an answer. The pyramid complexes at Teotihuacan, near modern Mexico City, are amongst the largest structures ever built in the ancient world. The Pyramid of the Sun is the third largest pyramid on Earth by volume. And here's the unsettling part. We don't know who built them. Teotihuacan predates the Aztecs, who themselves found the ruins and named them. The name means the place where men become gods. The original builder's identity remains unknown. There are many other monuments in the Americas. Some of them will still be talked about later in the iceberg. Pirates. The discovery and the colonization of the American continent was the main propeller for the advancement of seafaring and navigation, which prompted the so-called Golden Age of piracy. Pirates like Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Anne Bonny became legends. But piracy in this era didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged directly from the colonial economy. Many pirates were former privateers, sailors who had been licensed by European governments to raid enemy ships, then found themselves out of work when the wars ended. Others were former slaves or escaped servants who found in piracy one of the few routes to freedom and self-determination. Vikings. Remember the discovery of the Americas? Here's something that is not a theory or a myth. Vikings reached the Americas roughly 500 years before Columbus did. Around the year 1000, a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson sailed from Greenland and established a settlement at a place they called Vinland, somewhere in North America. In 1960, archaeologists discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. So why doesn't Leif Erikson get the same recognition as Columbus did? Partly because the Norse presence appears to have been short-lived, possibly only a few years, and partly because it didn't trigger the same chain of events. Columbus's voyages in 1492 led to sustained contact, colonization, and the transformation of both hemispheres. Leif Erikson's voyage was remarkable and then largely forgotten, at least outside of Scandinavia and the Norse sagas that recorded it. Tenochtitlan. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they were stunned by the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Built on a lake, the city of over 200,000 people had a sophisticated sanitation system, canals, dikes, floating gardens, and an organized sewage network that was far more advanced than most European cities at the time. They had public latrines, an active waste management workforce, and a system where human waste was collected and actually used as fertilizer for their floating gardens called chinampas. After the Spanish conquest, Tenochtitlan became the city we now know as Mexico City, and one of the most talked about subjects about Mexico City is the fact that it's sinking around 10 inches every year due to the fact that it was built on an island. Panama Canal. Few engineering projects in history have changed the world as directly and immediately as the Panama Canal did. Before the canal, a ship traveling from New York to San Francisco had two options: sail around the entire southern tip of South America, one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean on Earth, adding roughly 22,000 kilometers to the journey. The canal changed that entirely. The idea of cutting through the narrow isthmus of Panama had been discussed since the 16th century. The French tried it first under Ferdinand de Lesseps, the man who had successfully built the Suez Canal, but it was a catastrophe. The project was plagued by engineering failures, corruption, and most devastating, disease. Yellow fever and malaria killed an estimated 22,000 workers. The French company went bankrupt and the project collapsed. The United States took it over in 1904. The key insight that made American success possible when the French had failed was a massive campaign to eliminate the mosquitoes that carried yellow fever and malaria. The scale of the excavation is hard to grasp. Workers moved more than 170 million cubic meters of earth and rock. The Culebra Cut, a 13-kilometer channel, blasted through a mountain, was called by workers the ditch that never stayed dug because the walls kept sliding back in. Today, the canal handles about 3 to 4% of global naval trade, roughly 14,000 ships per year. It was expanded in 2016 to accommodate modern megaships. It remains one of the most important pieces of infrastructure on Earth, and it sits in a country that exists largely because the United States wanted to build a canal. Pan American Highway. The Pan American Highway is the longest road in the world, in theory. It was idealized as a road network running from Alaska all the way to Argentina. The total length, including all branches, is somewhere around 48,000 kilometers. The project was formally proposed at the 5th International Conference of American States. The idea was pan-continental unity, a highway that would bind the Americas together, facilitate trade, and allow overland travel across the entire hemisphere. Construction proceeded in phases across multiple countries throughout the 20th century, and today, most of it is complete. Most of it. There's one famous, notorious gap. In the region between Panama and Colombia, roughly 100 kilometers of jungle and swamp remain unconstructed. The Darien Gap, as it's known, is one of the most impenetrable stretches of wilderness in the Western Hemisphere. Dense rainforest, almost no infrastructure, and home to indigenous communities that have resisted outside intrusion for centuries. Completing the road in the Darien has been discussed for decades, but the project faces enormous oppositions. Environmentalists argue it would devastate one of the most diverse regions on Earth, and there are serious concerns about drug trafficking routes and disease spread. Potatoes and chocolate. Imagine Italy, but without tomatoes. Imagine Ireland without potatoes. Imagine Belgium and Switzerland without chocolate. The eastern and western hemispheres had been biologically separated for roughly 10,000 years. That means the plants, animals, and diseases on each side evolved independently, with almost no overlap. When contact finally happened, the biological exchange that followed, known as the Columbian Exchange, transformed the entire planet. Let's start with food, because this is where the impact is most immediate and most personal. The potato is native to the Andes, cultivated by indigenous people for thousands of years before Europeans ever saw one. When the Spanish brought it back to Europe in the late 1500s, it was initially regarded with suspicion. Within 2 centuries, it had become a dietary staple across Europe and had fundamentally altered the continent's demographics. Italian cuisine without tomatoes. Think about that. No tomato sauce, no pizza as we know it. Tomatoes are from Mexico and Central America. They didn't reach Italy until the 16th century and weren't widely eaten there for another century after that. The cacao tree is native to the tropical Americas, and the Maya and Aztecs had been processing it into a better ceremonial drink for centuries before Europeans arrived. The Spanish brought it back. Europeans added sugar, and within a few generations, chocolate had become one of the most desired commodities in the world. Chili peppers, also from the Americas, now foundational to cuisines in India, Thailand, China, Korea, and across sub-Saharan Africa. Cuisines that people think of as inherently spicy didn't have chili peppers at all before the Columbian Exchange. And that's not even mentioning tobacco, rubber, vanilla, peanuts, sunflowers, pineapples, and avocados. Historians have estimated that roughly 60% of the crops currently being grown originated in the Americas. The global population boom of the last 500 years is partially a story about American crops feeding people who had never heard of the continents they came from. Fauna. Being the most biodiverse continents, the Americas are also home to lots of animals: jaguars, giant anteaters, capybaras, poison dart frogs, sloths, macaws, Andean condors, and the incredibly diverse wildlife of the Galapagos Islands. Many species here exist nowhere else on Earth. The continent's isolation for millions of years created totally unique evolutionary paths. We'll still talk about many animals and creatures as we dive further in the iceberg. Natural phenomena. The Americas are home to some of the most bizarre natural phenomena on Earth, and most of them don't get nearly the attention they deserve. Take Catatumbo lightning in Venezuela, where the Catatumbo River meets Lake Maracaibo. There's a storm that almost never stops, up to 260 nights a year, sometimes 10 hours straight, producing up to 40,000 lightning strikes in a single night. It is the most lightning-dense location on Earth. Sailors used it as a navigation beacon for centuries. Almost nobody outside of Venezuela has heard of it. In Death Valley, rocks weighing hundreds of kilograms move on their own across a dry lake bed, leaving long trails in the mud behind them. Nobody saw it happen for decades. The explanation, confirmed only in 2014, involves a precise combination of rain, ice sheets, morning sun, and wind that creates conditions so specific that almost never occur, and almost nobody is ever there to witness them when they do. In the Peruvian Amazon, there's a river where the water boils, 6 kilometers long, up to 25 meters wide, reaching temperatures of 91 degrees Celsius. Animals that fall in are cooked alive. Geothermal water this hot normally requires a nearby volcano. The nearest one is 700 kilometers away. A Peruvian geoscientist spent years trying to confirm the river's existence after his grandfather told him stories about it as a child. He found it in 2011. The mechanism that heats it is still not understood. And in Centralia, Pennsylvania, an underground coal fire has been burning since 1962, when a trash fire ignited an exposed coal seam beneath the town. It spread through a network of underground tunnels, produced toxic gases, cracked roads open from below, and eventually forced the evacuation of almost the entire town. Today, Centralia has a population of around 5 people. The fire is expected to keep burning for another 250 years. Lost cities. Humans have been inventing lost cities in the Americas since Europeans arrived, and occasionally, unexpectedly, some of them turn out to be real. El Dorado didn't start as a city, it started as a ritual. A Muisca king who covered himself in gold dust and dove into a sacred lake as an offering. The lake was real. Gold objects were found at its edges. Centuries of wishful thinking inflated a genuine ritual into a fantasy of an entire golden empire hidden in the jungle. Paititi is a less famous but more actively searched for, a legendary Inca city said to lie somewhere in the jungle east of the Andes, where Inca nobility supposedly fled after the Spanish conquest. In Honduras in 2015, a team using LiDAR discovered plazas, pyramids, a cache of artifacts unlike anything previously documented from the region. The culture that built it is unknown. We know almost nothing about it. The pattern is consistent. Things dismissed as legend keep turning out to have a basis in reality. The jungle hides things very well, and we are only beginning to have the technology to look properly. Triple Frontier. Where Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay meet, there's a region known as the Triple Frontier, and for decades it has been one of the most genuinely lawless zones in the Western Hemisphere. Ciudad del Este in Paraguay sits at its heart. At its peak, it was considered one of the largest black markets in the world. Counterfeit goods, smuggling, money laundering, organized crime, operating in the gap between 3 jurisdictions, none of which exercised full control. But the Triple Frontier's reputation goes beyond ordinary organized crime. Following the 1994 bombing of a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, the deadliest terrorist attack in Argentine history, killing 85 people, investigators traced financial and logistical connections back to the region. Both the US and Argentine governments have identified the Triple Frontier as a significant fundraising hub for Hezbollah, with the large Lebanese Chinese diaspora community in Ciudad del Este allegedly used as cover for moving money across borders. The CIA, Mossad, and various South American intelligence services have all reportedly maintained active operations in the area. After 9/11, the region attracted serious international attention as part of a broader look at terrorist financing networks in the Western Hemisphere. Whether the threat was as significant as intelligence agencies claimed, or whether the Muslim community there was largely scapegoated, remains genuinely contested. What isn't contested is that the combination of weak governance, porous borders, and enormous cash flows made the Triple Frontier exactly the kind of place where people who don't want to be found go to not be found. Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachians are among the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, once as tall as the Himalayas, now worn down to rounded, fog-covered ridges wrapped in forests so dense that entire hollows can go unvisited for years. That age, that density, and that isolation have produced something rare, a place in the eastern United States that still genuinely feels like it has secrets. The folklore of Appalachia is some of the richest and most unsettling in North America. Generations of mountain communities, cut off from outside contact for long stretches of history, developed their own oral traditions. Stories of skinwalkers, of creatures called the Wampus Cat, of ghostly lights moving through the ridges at night. Then there are real mysteries. People disappear in the Appalachians at a rate that has attracted genuine attention from researchers. Author David Paulides, in his Missing 411 series, documented clusters of disappearances in national parks, many concentrated in the Appalachian region, involving experienced hikers who vanished without trace, sometimes in conditions that made conventional explanations difficult. The National Park Service does not maintain a centralized database of missing persons across parks, a fact that itself has fueled suspicion. The atmosphere of the place is hard to describe to someone who hasn't been there. Sessions of the forest are cathedral quiet. Fog rolls in fast. Trails disappear, and the terrain that looks gentle on a map turns steep and disorienting on foot. It is a place that has absorbed an enormous amount of human history, indigenous, colonial, industrial, and wears it quietly in abandoned coal towns, in cemeteries on hillsides, and in dialects that preserve words that disappeared from standard English centuries ago. Witch trials. When people think of witch trials or the Inquisition, they think only of medieval Europe. But these practices were also brought to America and reached even greater heights here. Everyone knows Salem. What most people don't know is that Salem was neither the first, the largest, nor the deadliest witch trial in the Americas. The Spanish Inquisition operated across Latin America for centuries, with tribunals established in Lima, Mexico City, and Cartagena, continually well into the 1800s. Thousands were tried for heresy, witchcraft, and religious non-conformity across the colonial world. In the Andes, the campaign known as the Extirpación de Idolatrias saw colonial authorities mount systematic campaigns against native religious practices throughout the 17th century.
Let's go bowling.
Blank were here first. The mainstream historical position is that Columbus in 1492 and the Norse around the year 1000 represent the known cases of Old World contact with the Americas. Everything else is disputed, but the disputed pile is larger and more interesting than most people realize. The Phoenicians were the largest maritime civilization of the ancient Mediterranean. They sailed to Britain for tin, established colonies across North Africa and Spain, and may have circumnavigated Africa. Some researchers have argued that Phoenician ships following Atlantic currents could have reached the Americas. A handful of inscribed stones found in Brazil and North America have been claimed as Phoenician in origin. None have been conclusively accepted by mainstream archaeology, but none have been conclusively debunked either. Roman artifacts have turned up in genuinely puzzling context in the Americas. A Roman figurine found buried in a pre-Columbian site in Mexico. Roman coins found in locations that resist easy explanation. The standard response is contamination. Items brought over after contact and deposited in older layers. But a 2013 study of a shipwreck off the coast of Brazil found amphoras, Roman storage jars, in configurations that some researchers argued were too numerous and too structured to be post-Columbian debris. The study was controversial and has not been widely accepted. The Egyptians. This one is harder to argue archaeologically, but it keeps coming up, partly because of the pyramid parallel, which mainstream archaeology explains through independent invention, and partly because of the cocaine mummies. We'll get to the cocaine mummies in the next layer, and they are exactly as strange as they sound. The Chinese. In 2002, a retired British submarine commander named Gavin Menzies published a book claiming that a Chinese fleet under Admiral Zheng He circumnavigated the globe and reached the Americas in 1421, 70 years before Columbus. The book was a bestseller. Professional historians were almost universally scathing, pointing to an absence of verifiable primary source evidence, but Zheng He's fleet was real and the voyages documented in Chinese records do leave some gaps. Polynesian contact. This one is the most archaeologically solid of the group and is increasingly accepted in mainstream research. Genetic studies of indigenous South American populations have found Polynesian genetic markers. The sweet potato, which is native to South America, was present across Polynesia centuries before European contact. The evidence for at least one significant contact event between Polynesia and South America is now strong enough that most researchers take it seriously. The honest answer is that we don't know how isolated the Americas really were before 1492. The ocean is large, but humans have been crossing large bodies of water for longer than we tend to assume. There was even a French guy who went from Europe to America in a barrel. So it is not crazy to assume that great navigators throughout history might have ended up in the Americas, unintentionally or not. Many cowboys. When people think of cowboys, they think of the Wild West gunslinger type, but cowboys in many different forms were present in all of the Americas, with quite similar practices and cultures. The vaquero came first. Cattle ranching in the Americas began in colonial Mexico, and the vaquero developed the entire foundational toolkit: the lasso, the rodeo, the chaps, the wide-brimmed hat, techniques for driving cattle across open range. When the American cattle industry expanded into the Southwest, it absorbed the culture wholesale, anglicized the vocabulary, and forgot where it came from. The word buckaroo is a direct corruption of vaquero. In the grasslands of Argentina and Uruguay, the gaucho developed completely independently. Same horsemanship, same open-range lifestyle, different tools. The boleadores instead of a lasso, a facon knife instead of a six-shooter. The gaucho became as mythologized in South American culture as the cowboy did in North America. In the flooded tropical plains of Venezuela and Colombia, the llanero rode through conditions that would have been impossible anywhere else. Half the year underwater, half baked dry. Simón Bolívar built his liberation armies largely on llanero cavalry. The pattern is striking. Separated by thousands of kilometers, these cultures produced nearly identical archetypes. The same mythology of freedom, self-reliance, and life on the frontier. Open grassland, large herds, and the horse will apparently produce the same kind of men every time. Terra preta. The Amazon's natural soil is terrible for agriculture, thin, acidic, and quickly depleted, so it came as a genuine surprise when scientists discovered patches of extraordinarily rich, deep, self-regenerating black soil scattered across the Amazon basin. They called it terra preta, dark earth in Portuguese. It was made by humans. Pre-Columbian Amazonian peoples created it deliberately through a combination of charred organic matter, bone, manure, and compost incorporated into the soil over generations. The charcoal component locks carbon into a stable structure that persists for millennia and supports the microbial life that keeps the soil productive. Terra preta is evidence that the Amazon supported large, sophisticated populations long before Europeans arrived. It has attracted serious modern interest as a tool for restoring degraded tropical soils and sequestering carbon. We still don't fully understand how to replicate it. The people who perfected it over thousands of years are gone, and we are left trying to reverse engineer what they built. Sequoia syllabary. In the early 19th century, a Cherokee man named Sequoia did something with almost no parallel in recorded history. He single-handedly invented a complete writing system for a language that had never been written down, while he himself was illiterate. Sequoia was not formally educated. He was a silversmith who had become fascinated by written language, what he called talking leaves, and spent roughly 12 years developing an 86-character syllabary for Cherokee. The results were immediate and dramatic. Within a few years of his introduction in 1821, Cherokee literacy had surpassed that of many surrounding white communities. The Cherokee Phoenix, the first Native American newspaper, began publishing in 1828. The syllabary is still in use today. Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears is probably the most well-known entry in this layer, and this story deserves to land with its full weight. In 1830, the United States Congress passed the Indian Removal Act under President Andrew Jackson, authorizing the forced relocation of the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to designated Indian Territory west of the Mississippi, in present-day Oklahoma. The forced removal began in earnest in 1838. Cherokee people were rounded up by the U.S. Army, held in stockades, and marched hundreds of miles through harsh conditions. Estimates of the death toll vary, but somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 Cherokee people, out of a nation of roughly 16,000, died during the removal from disease, exposure, starvation, and exhaustion. The Cherokee called it Nuna Dal Tsuni, the trail where they cried. Stranded Europeans. The official story of European contact with the Americas has clear dates and famous names, but lurking at the edges of that story are figures who suggest the reality was considerably messier. Europeans who were already in the Americas before the official voyages of discovery, living among indigenous people for reasons that history never fully recorded. The most compelling case is the Bajorel de Cananea, when the Portuguese explorer Martim Alfonso de Sousa arrived on the Brazilian coast in 1531. He encountered a man who had apparently been living there for decades. He's referred to in historical documents simply as O Bajorel, the Bachelor, suggesting a university education. Nobody knows exactly who he was, how he got there, or when he arrived. He served as an interpreter and intermediary between the Sousa and the indigenous people, which suggests he had been there long enough to become fluent in Tupi. Some accounts describe him as uncooperative, refusing to fully assist the Portuguese expedition, suggesting his loyalties had shifted considerably from whatever world he had come from. In North America, when early French explorers pushed into the interior, they occasionally encountered indigenous communities that already contained European individuals, men who had arrived via shipwreck, desertion, or simple wandering, and had been absorbed into the community years or decades earlier. These figures sit in a historical blind spot. They arrived before the record-keeping started, they lived outside the world that kept records, and they left almost no trace except the occasional puzzled mention in Explorer's Journal, but they suggest that the boundary between the old world and the new was breached earlier, more quietly and more personally than the history books tend to acknowledge. Percy Fawcett. Percy Fawcett is one of the great obsessive figures of exploration history, a British artillery officer turned Amazon explorer who became convinced that a vast, ancient civilization lay hidden in the Brazilian jungle, and who walked again into that jungle in 1925 and was never seen again. Fawcett called it the City of Z. Based on his reading of old Portuguese documents and his own explorations of the Amazon basin over more than a decade, he became convinced that a sophisticated pre-Columbian civilization had existed deep in Brazil, one that would rewrite the history of the Americas. In 1925, he sent back a final letter from a camp they called Dead Horse Camp, describing his intended route. Then, nothing. What happened to Fawcett has never been established. Dozens of subsequent expeditions went looking for him. Several of those also disappeared or suffered serious casualties. Various accounts have emerged over the decades from indigenous communities describing the fate of a group of white men matching Fawcett's description, but none have been verified. The strange coda to the story is that Fawcett may not have been entirely wrong. The LiDAR surveys and archaeological work we've discussed in earlier layers have revealed that the Amazon did support large, complex civilizations, the Terra Preta, the earthworks, the hidden cities. The City of Z, as Fawcett imagined it, probably didn't exist, but the instinct that drove him, that the Amazon was hiding something significant, turns out to have been correct. He was just about a century ahead of the technology needed to find it. Atacama alien skeleton. In 2003, a small mummified skeleton was found in the Atacama Desert in Chile. It had an elongated skull, fewer ribs than a normal human, and bone density, suggesting it was several years old at the time of death rather than a fetus. For years, it circulated in UFO communities as definitive proof of extraterrestrial life. It was called Ata. It appeared in a documentary and was taken very seriously by people who wanted it to be an alien. A 2018 genomic study published in the journal Genome Research sequenced Ada's DNA and found that she was entirely human, with a genome consistent with the indigenous people of the Atacama region. The unusual skeletal features were the result of multiple rare genetic mutations affecting bone development, several of which had never been documented together in a single individual before. Megafauna. Until roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, the Americas were home to an extraordinarily array of large animals that make the current wildlife look modest by comparison. Mammoths and mastodons roamed across North America in large numbers. The woolly mammoth in the north, the American mastodon across a broader range. Ground sloths, the size of elephants, moved through the forests. Some species reached 6 meters in length and could rear up on their hind legs to browse treetops. Glyptodons were armadillo, relatives the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, encased in a domed, bony shell. Saber-toothed cats, Smilodon, hunted across both continents with canine teeth reaching 28 centimeters. The American lion was larger than any lion alive today. Terror birds, flightless predatory birds standing 2 meters tall, dominated parts of South America. Short-faced bears, the largest terrestrial mammalian carnivore to ever live in the Americas, could reach 900 kilograms and ran down prey on long, powerful legs. All of them are gone within a geologically short window around the end of the last ice age. What killed them is one of the most debated questions in paleontology. The two leading explanations are climate change, the rapid warming at the end of the ice age disrupting ecosystems, and human hunting pressure, as the first peoples entering the Americas encountered animals that had never seen humans before and had no fear of them. Most researchers today think both factors contributed, with the balance varying by species and region. The loss of the American megafauna cascaded through entire ecosystems. Animals that depended on mammoths for habitat modification, plants that depended on giant ground sloths for seed dispersal, predators that lost their primary prey. The extinction event reshaped the Americas in ways that are still felt in the ecology of the continents today. Coke in Egyptian mummies. This one is exactly as strange as it sounds, and it has never been fully explained. In 1992, a German toxicologist named Svetlana Balabanova published the results of chemical analysis performed on 9 Egyptian mummies in the Munich Museum collection. The analysis found traces of cocaine and nicotine in the hair, skin, and bones of the mummies, some of which dated back over 3,000 years. But this should be impossible. Cocaine comes from the coca plant, which is native to South America. Nicotine comes from the tobacco plant, also native to the Americas. In the year 1000 BC, there was no known contact between Egypt and the Americas. There was no route by which these substances should have been present in Egyptian mummies. The initial reaction from mainstream archaeology was swift and dismissive: contamination, error, methodological problems. Balabanova's findings were widely attacked, but she had used multiple independent testing methods, and subsequent testing of other mummies, including by independent laboratories, produced similar results. The findings have been replicated enough times that simple contamination or error is difficult to sustain as the only explanation. So what is the explanation? Nobody knows for certain. The possibilities range from undocumented ancient trade routes connecting the old and new worlds, to the existence of now extinct old world plants containing similar compounds, to forms of contact between civilizations that our current historical models simply don't account for. It connects directly to the pre-Columbian contact theories from the previous layer. If cocaine and nicotine are genuinely present in ancient Egyptian mummies, then either the story of contact between the hemispheres is far more complicated than we think, or there is some other explanation that nobody has yet convincingly identified. Mainstream archaeology has largely chosen to not engage with this question. Selknam. The Selknam, also known as the Ona, were an indigenous people of Tierra del Fuego, the archipelago at the southern tip of South America. They had lived there for thousands of years, hunting guanaco across the windswept plains of the main island, developing a rich spiritual culture centered on a complex initiation ceremony called the Hain. They were, by any measure, extraordinarily well adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth. But in the late 19th century, sheep ranchers arrived. What followed is known in Argentina and Chile as the Selknam genocide, and it was as straightforward and brutal as that name implies. The Selknam hunted guanaco. The ranchers brought sheep. The Selknam, whose concept of land use didn't include private property, hunted the sheep as they had hunted the guanaco. The ranchers responded by hiring hunters to kill Selknam people, paying bounties for ears and hands as proof of kills. Entire families were hunted. Women and children were not spared. The few survivors were rounded up and placed on missions. At the time of European contact, the Selknam population was estimated at around 4,000 people. By the early 20th century, they had been reduced to a few dozen. The last fully initiated member of the Hain ceremony died in the 1990s. The last fluent native speaker of the Selknam language died in 2021. This happened at the end of the 19th century, not in the distant colonial past, but during the lifetime of people's great-grandparents. It was carried out not by a conquering empire but by private landowners operating with the tacit approval of the Chilean and Argentine states. It received almost no international attention at the time and remains poorly known outside of the southern cone. Yellowstone. Yellowstone is famous as a national park. Geysers, hot springs, bison, tourists in matching rain jackets. But what is less discussed is what lies beneath it. Yellowstone sits on top of one of the largest active supervolcanic systems on Earth. The Yellowstone caldera, the collapsed remnant of previous eruptions, is roughly 55 by 72 kilometers across. The magma chamber beneath it is estimated to contain enough material to fill the Grand Canyon more than 11 times. It has erupted catastrophically 3 times in the past 2.1 million years. The largest of those eruptions deposited ash across most of North America and would, if it happened today, be an extinction-level event for a significant portion of the continent. The question everybody wants answered is, when is it going to erupt again? The honest answer is that nobody knows, and the people who monitor it are careful to say so. The interval between the 3 major eruptions has been roughly 600,000 to 800,000 years. The last major eruption was approximately 640,000 years ago. The math is not comforting, but geologists are quick to point out that supervolcano eruptions don't follow a reliable schedule. What Yellowstone does do constantly is move. The ground beneath the magma chamber rises and falls by centimeters every year. The entire system is alive in a way that most people standing at the edge of Old Faithful don't fully appreciate. A full Yellowstone eruption would deposit ash meters deep across the central United States, collapse agricultural systems across the continent, and inject enough sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to trigger a volcanic winter lasting years. It is not a question of if, it is, on a geological timescale, question of when. Cryptids and Mapinguari. Every continent has its own cryptids, creatures reported by witnesses but unconfirmed by science. The Americas have an unusually rich tradition, from the Sasquatch of the Pacific Northwest to the Chupacabra of Latin America. Most of these can be dismissed fairly comfortably as misidentification, folklore, or hoax. But one American cryptid sits in a more interesting category. The Mapinguari is a creature reported across the Amazon basin and parts of Bolivia and Brazil, described consistently as a large, slow-moving, foul-smelling bipedal creature with thick hide, long claws, and a mouth in an unusual position on its body. Indigenous peoples across a wide geographic range have described it independently, with remarkably consistent details for centuries. What makes the Mapinguari genuinely interesting is the comparison with the giant ground sloth. As we covered in the previous layer, giant ground sloths lived in America until roughly 10,000 years ago. Large, slow-moving creatures with thick hides and long claws, some capable of moving bipedally. Some paleontologists have seriously proposed that the Mapinguari legend preserves the folk memory of an actual animal, either a giant ground sloth that survived longer in the Amazon than the fossil record currently shows, or a deep cultural memory passed down across hundreds of generations from the people who actually encountered them. This is not a fringe position. Respected researchers have published on this connection. The Amazon, as we keep discovering, conceals things effectively. The possibility that a relict population of ground sloths survived into more recent times in the depths of the rainforest is not considered impossible by everyone who has looked at the evidence carefully. Mapimi Silent Zone. in a remote patch of the Chihuahuan Desert in northern Mexico, in a region called the Mapimi Biosphere Reserve. There is a zone where, according to local legend and a persistent body of anecdotal reports, radio signals don't work, compasses behave strangely, migratory animals avoid it, meteorites fall there in unusual concentrations, people get lost, strange lights appear at night. It is called the Zona del Silencio, the Silent Zone, and it has attracted a mixture of serious scientific attention and enthusiastic paranormal tourism since the 1970s, when an American test rocket carrying two small radioactive containers went off course and crashed in the region, prompting a significant US and Mexico government recovery operation that brought unusual official attention to a very remote area. The scientific explanations for the various phenomena are available and mostly mundane. The high concentration of meteorites is real and is explained by the geology of the region. The desert surface preserves them well, and they are easy to spot. The radio interference claims are difficult to verify systematically. The strange lights are likely atmospheric phenomena common to desert environments. The compass anomalies, if real, would suggest unusual mineral deposits in the subsurface, which is plausible given the region's geology. What's harder to explain away is the location. The Mapimi Silent Zone sits at the same latitude, 27 degrees north, as the Egyptian pyramids, the Bermuda Triangle, the Himalayas, and several other sites that attract more than their share of anomalous claims. Whether that's meaningful or a coincidence that pattern-seeking humans have inflated into significance is either an obvious question or an obvious answer. Bolivian Navy. The country of Bolivia has a navy, but it has no sea.
But what the hell?